Everybody listening to this knows what toothache feels like, and it is worth asking why it feels like that. Inside every tooth, there is a chamber, and in that chamber, there is soft tissue with its own nerve supply and its own blood supply. That chamber is sealed. It is wrapped in dentine, and the dentine is wrapped in enamel, which is the hardest tissue in the human body. Now inflame the tissue inside. Inflammation means swelling, and swelling means pressure. Everywhere else in your body, swollen tissue has somewhere to go. It pushes outwards, and the skin stretches. Inside a tooth, there is nowhere. The pressure builds inside a rigid box with a nerve in it. That is the specific quality of the pain. It is not a cut, and it is not an ache. It is something trapped. And before antibiotics, this was not only miserable, it was dangerous. An untreated abscess at the root of a lower molar does not stay in the tooth. It tracks down into the jaw, and from the jaw into the floor of the mouth and the neck. That condition has a name and a history, and for most of human history, a serious dental infection could and did kill people. So this is not a video about cosmetics. This is a video about the oldest medical problem that the human body flatly refuses to fix by itself. Start there because it is the fact the whole subject hangs on. Break a bone, and given time and reasonable luck, the bone knits. Cut your skin, and it closes. Tear a muscle, and it repairs. Damage your liver, and a surprising amount of it grows back. Enamel does none of this. Enamel is laid down before the tooth erupts by cells that then die or are shed. Once the tooth is in your mouth, there are no living cells inside the enamel at all. There is nothing in there to do any rebuilding. The dentine underneath can respond a little. It can lay down a defensive layer and try to wall the chamber off. But it cannot put back what is gone. Nothing in you can. So a hole in a tooth is permanent, in a way that almost no other injury to a human being is permanent, which means the damage accumulates across a whole lifetime in the one part of you that never gets a second attempt. Hold on to that. It comes back at the end, and it explains something. Now, why do teeth go wrong in the first place? There are two quite different answers, and they belong to different worlds. The first is decay, and decay is a chemistry problem. Your mouth contains bacteria that live on carbohydrate, sugars and cooked starches mostly. They metabolize it, and they produce acid as a waste product. Enamel is a mineral, and mineral dissolves in acid. Below about pH 5.5, it starts to go. Between meals, saliva buffers the acid and puts some mineral back. That is the repair mechanism, and it is chemical, not biological. So the thing that matters is not how much sugar you eat. It is how many hours a day your teeth spend under acid. That is why sipping something sweet all afternoon is worse for you than eating a cake in 4 minutes. The second failure has nothing to do with bacteria at all, and it dominates the ancient record. It is where grind grain between two stones, and the flour carries stone grit in it. Every meal is very mildly abrasive. Ancient teeth are frequently worn completely flat, right through the enamel and into the dentine, and in bad cases straight into the pulp chamber. At which point you have an opening into the sealed room and an abscess without a single cavity being involved. So there are two ways to arrive at exactly the same night of pain, and which one you get depends on what you eat and how it was prepared. Which brings us to the shape of the record, and to a story that is usually told badly. The usual version is that hunter-gatherers had perfect teeth, and farming ruined them. The first half is roughly true, and for a boring reason. Meat, fish, and fat do not feed the bacteria. Foragers in the record often have heavily worn teeth and very little decay. Then farming arrives, the diet becomes cereal, the carbohydrate goes up, and the caries rate goes up with it. That much is real, and it is visible in cemetery after cemetery. But the simple version is wrong, and there is a site that proves it. Taforalt in Morocco, a cave also called the Grotte of Pigeons. The people buried there lived around 15,000 years ago. They were hunter-gatherers. Nobody in North Africa was farming anything. And their teeth are a disaster. In the adults, roughly half of all the teeth examined show decay. That is a rate you would associate with an industrial city. The explanation is in what they were eating, enormous quantities of wild plant food, including acorns and pine nuts. Sweet, starchy, and sticky enough to sit on a tooth for hours. So it was never farming as such. It was the carbohydrate and the stickiness and the hours. Farming simply made that combination normal for almost everybody, almost everywhere. And then, thousands of years later, refined sugar arrived and made it worse again, and that is a separate story with its own dates. Sugar cane reaches the Mediterranean slowly, and then the Atlantic plantations make it cheap, and the decay rate in European skeletons climbs along with the trade figures. By the end of the 1500s, visitors to the English court are remarking on Elizabeth I's black teeth. Sugar was a luxury, and she could afford it daily. Now, what did people actually do about it? The oldest answer we have is also the smallest, and you have almost certainly done it yourself. Look at the side of an ancient molar, where it touches its neighbor, and you sometimes find a groove. A small, rounded channel worn into the enamel, in a place where chewing cannot possibly have put it. It is the wrong shape for wear from food, and the wrong place for wear from wear. It is exactly the shape you get from a stiff blade of grass, a splinter of bone, or a thin twig, pushed into the gap and worked back and forth. The interpretation is a toothpick, something stiff, used repeatedly in the same gap over years. These grooves are not rare, and they are not recent. They turn up on Neanderthals and on hominins older than Neanderthals. At Cova Forada, in Spain, there is a Neanderthal with clear gum disease, and the grooves cluster exactly where the disease is worst, which suggests the picking was not idle. It was aimed at the part that hurt. David Freyer and colleagues have argued from the Crepina Neanderthals for something they call dental manipulation, grooves, scratches, and chips consistent with somebody working on their own mouth with a tool. The objection is a good one and worth stating. Teeth in the past were also used as a third hand. People clamp hide in their teeth to scrape it and grip fiber in their teeth to twist it, and both leave marks. So some of what looks like treatment may just be work. But a groove that follows the disease gap and not the useful one is hard to explain that way. And if it is treatment, then this is the oldest evidence we have of anybody deliberately doing anything to a body to make it hurt less. Older than any medicine. Now the find that changes what you thought was possible. Mehrgarh, in Baluchistan, in what is now Pakistan, a Neolithic settlement, occupied from around 9,000 years ago. In 2006, a team led by Alfredo Coppa published a short paper in Nature about the graveyard there. They had 11 human teeth from 9 different adults with holes drilled in them. Not chipped, drilled. The holes are round, between about 1 and 3 millimeters across, and up to 3.5 millimeters deep. Inside the holes there are concentric striations. The marks a rotating bit leaves as it cuts. Mehrgarh was a bead-making town. The site produces flint drill heads used to bore stone and shell beads, turned with a bow drill. So the technology already existed, and somebody pointed it at a person. That is worth sitting with for a second. The instrument was not invented for the mouth. It was borrowed from the bead workshop next door. 4 of the drilled teeth have decay associated with them. And here's the detail that matters most. The rims of the holes show where from chewing that happened after the drilling, which means these were not done to a corpse and not done to a dying person. The patients got up and went on eating for years. The holes are also almost all on molars at the back, where nobody can see them. That argues hard against decoration, and for treatment. Somebody was trying to get at something and relieve it. No filling material survives in the Mehrgarh holes, but that does not mean there was none. Anything soft put in there would be long gone. And we know that filling was being done because elsewhere it survived. 2 sites, both in Italy, both older than Mehrgarh. At Villabruna, in the north, there is a molar from about 14,000 years ago with a cavity in it, and inside the cavity there are fine scratch marks. Somebody had scraped the decayed tissue out with a sharp point. That is the earliest known attempt to treat a carious tooth. At Riparo Fredian, in Tuscany, from around 13,000 years ago, there are 2 upper front teeth with large cavities. The cavities have been deliberately enlarged. There are striations on the walls from a tool. And inside them, there is bitumen, mixed with plant fibers and hair. Bitumen, which is natural asphalt, and which we spent a whole episode on because it is one of the adhesives ancient people used to half their tools. The same black sticky material that held a stone point onto a shaft was being packed into a hole in somebody's front tooth. Later, at Lance in Slovenia, from about 6,500 years ago, there's a cracked canine filled with beeswax. So the sequence is not nothing, nothing, nothing modern dentistry. It is scraping, then drilling, then filling, spread across thousands of years and several unconnected parts of the world, all of it before writing. There's also the treatment that everybody thinks of first, and it is the hardest one to see. Pulling the tooth out. Extraction is almost certainly older than any of this because it needs no equipment and no theory. The problem is proving it. A socket that has healed overlooks the same whether the tooth was pulled, knocked out in a fight, or fell out from gum disease. What you can say is that healed sockets are everywhere, and that people plainly live for years with teeth missing. And the bone gives you a time scale. Once a tooth is gone, the socket fills in and the ridge shrinks back, and that takes months, so a smooth ridge means the person lived well past whatever happened. And in some places, teeth were removed on purpose, and not because they hurt at all. Deliberate removal of the front teeth in adolescence as a mark of belonging is documented across several regions and periods, which is a useful reminder that not everything done to a mouth is medicine. Then there is the other end of the problem. Once the tooth is gone, can you replace it? The Etruscans in Italy from around the 7th century before the Common Era made appliances out of gold. Thin bands of gold, formed into a loop that goes around the surviving teeth on either side of the gap, riveted to hold a replacement in place. The replacement is sometimes a human tooth and sometimes an animal tooth, often ox. These are genuinely striking objects, and the gold is soft enough to be shaped cold, without heating the metal in the mouth. Whether they work for chewing is doubted. Most are on front teeth, and quite a few are on women. The current reading of most specialists is that these are display as much as function, which is not a criticism. A visible gap in the front of your mouth has a social cost, and that is a real problem to solve. And now the part of the story I find most extraordinary, which is not about any technique. It is about what people thought was happening. For roughly 3,000 years, across cultures that had no contact with each other, the explanation for toothache was a worm. There is a Babylonian tablet in the British Museum that tells the story. The worm asks the gods for a home and is given a gum to sit inside and drink the blood of the tooth. The same idea turns up in Egypt, in Chinese medical writing, in India, in classical and medieval Europe. And you can see exactly why. The hole in the tooth looks bored, like something has eaten into it, and the pain gnaws. It is a hypothesis that fits every observation available to somebody without a microscope. It is also, and this is the part that stings, a testable one. At any point in 3,000 years, somebody could have split a rotten tooth open and looked. It survived into the 1700s, and one of the people who had to argue it down was Pierre Fauchard, the French surgeon usually called the father of modern dentistry. He looked into a great many mouths, reported that he had never once found a worm, and named sugar instead. Which means the theory of the tooth worm ran for something like 3 millennia, and was correct about roughly nothing, and yet the treatments that went with it included picking, scraping, drilling, and filling. Things that worked. The practice ran ahead of the explanation by thousands of years. That is normal, and it is worth saying out loud. So let us go back to the thing at the start, because it explains the rest. Almost every part of the human body is provisional. It gets damaged and it rebuilds itself quietly without being asked. Enamel is the exception. It is finished before it is ever used. It contains nothing living, and it will never be repaired from the inside for as long as you exist. Every other injury you have ever had, your body treated. This one, it simply will not. So dentistry is not a luxury that arrived with civilization. It is the one branch of medicine that had to be invented because the alternative was nothing at all, which is why we find it so early. A drilled molar 9,000 years ago is not a curiosity. It is the predictable result of a permanent injury in a species clever enough to hold a drill. And there is one more thing in the Mehrgarh material that is easy to walk past. To drill a hole into a living person's molar with a flint bit and a bow, with no anesthetic, that person has to sit still and let you. They have to believe you're trying to help, and keep believing it while it's happening. So what those 11 teeth actually record is not just a technique. It is somebody in pain, and somebody else who was allowed to do something about it. Trust is part of the archaeological record, in other words, and here it takes the form of a small round hole. The enamel could not heal. So another person did the healing instead, badly, with a bead drill 9,000 years ago, and the patient went back to eating.